First, I'd like to say good morning and welcome to the second in our series of webinars as part of the BSBI's Irish Grasslands Project, sponsored by National Parks and Wildlife Service in Ireland and the Centre for Environmental Data and Recording in Northern Ireland. Today we have Dr. Lynda Weekes leading us through an introduction to vegetative grass identification, and I'll introduce her properly in a moment. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm Sarah Pearce, I'm the BSBI Ireland Officer. We also have Louise Marsh with us today, BSBI's Communications Manager, and she'll be on hand to help out with some of the questions throughout the session and help with the question and answer session at the end. If you have questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A function, and Louise and I will keep an eye on that while Lynda is speaking. If there are things that we're able to answer, we'll do that in text at the time, and we'll collate the rest for the question and answer session at the end. We hope you really enjoyed today's session. We'd be grateful if you could let us know what you think. Let us know if you have any further questions. There will be a link to a feedback form sent out tomorrow for people who were here last week. Thank you for sending your feedback in and for joining us again. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lynda Weekes. Lynda is a lecturer in wildlife biology at IT Tralee in County Kerry. She lectures in botany among other topics. She previously worked as a lowland semi-natural grassland surveyor for the Burren Project in County Clare and for the National Biodiversity Data Centre, collating the Irish National Vegetation Database. Beyond grasslands, her other major interest is aquatic vegetation ecology, and she's run lots of fantastic training events for BSBI and other groups over the years. So without further ado, over to you, Lynda. Hopefully.
I'm coming.
Slight delay.
Thanks a million, Sarah. That's very good of you. Welcome to everybody, and just want to say, first of all, thank you very much to the BSBI for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure, and it's a fantastic opportunity for people to learn about grasses and hopefully make grasses more accessible to everybody, because grasses can be quite intimidating to some people. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll be much more familiar and more comfortable with grasses. What I'll do is I'll just share my presentation here just to start with. Here it is here. And then we can get going. So hopefully you can see that screen. If you can't, you might let me know. First of all, what I'd like to do is just thank also the National Parks and Wildlife Service and CEDaR for making funding available for these webinars. It's just brilliant, and it's unusual these days to actually get free access to workshops and ID sessions. So fair play to everybody who got this together, and of course, not least the BSBI as well. So those of you who were at the webinar last week with Fionnuala O'Neill will have touched upon vegetative features when she was talking about identification of grasses. So let me just see now, sorry now. Yeah, so just in terms of vegetative identification, you'll see from Fionnuala's talk last week that when you are identifying grasses from a floristic point of view, you also need vegetative features as well. So they go hand in hand with each other. But for our purposes today, we're really going to concentrate on the vegetative identification only today. So what I mean by vegetative identification, those are the non-flowering parts of grasses. So that's what we're looking at today. So the plan is we'll have a look very briefly at an introduction into grasses. I'm not going to repeat really what Fionnuala said last week. She gave a really nice brief introduction into grasses. And if you're interested in that, feel free. I think Sarah has put it up on the BSBI website as a YouTube video. So feel free to have a look at that. It's a really, really good session. So you can get a nice introduction there. I'll just briefly touch on a few things, that's all. Then we'll get into why it's important to identify using vegetative features of grasses and what do you need to do that, And also we'll have a look at important terminology for vegetative identification. And then we'll have a look, there are some confusion species that you might confuse with a grass like sedges and rushes, and we'll just make sure that you're clear on what a grass is as opposed to a sedge or a rush. So basically what we're doing is the essentials today. So it's apologies to those of you who are more experienced, you might find it a little bit basic, but this is part 1 of 2 sessions. We're going to have another webinar next week. We'll go into more detail and we'll have a look at actual identification using keys, and we'll have a look at specimens themselves. But to do that, we have to have a really good, solid background and be clear and sure of the features that we need for identification. So today is all about introducing you to all the features that are really important, and hopefully by the end of today you'll be clear on how to look for those features and be happy to go out into the field yourselves and look for those features and be confident that you found them properly. So that's what today is about, and then next week we'll look more on building those ID skills. So hopefully that will suit you all today. So just to say how many Irish species there are, and Fionnuala touched on this last week as well, there are approximately 100 in Ireland. So that's quite, that's really doable. 100 species is, it's a manageable number to become familiar with, which is, it's a good thing. If you're into the thousands, it's quite a feat. But so grasses are pretty accessible, and it's pretty, not easy, but it's challenging, but it's possible to get to know all the grasses in Ireland with times, which is really, really good. So 100 species, it includes all the native species and all archaeophytes. So archaeophytes are plants or grasses that were non-native but were introduced before the 1500s. So there's approximately 100 of those. And if you look at, it also includes the common neophytes. Those are introduced species. They're non-natives that have been in Ireland since the 1500s. So, you know, you can more or less take it that they've been here a long, long time. And you know, it's a bit Irish, isn't it? Once a blow-in, always a blow-in, even if you're here for hundreds of years. But we have, out of those, we have about 80 species that are actually native and are ancient and have been here a long, long time. Out of those native species, we have 26 species that are very common, and we have 22 of those species that are pretty rare or very rare. So we've got, and then all the other species in between are quite frequent. So there's a lot of species that you will come across. So what are the advantages of learning ID vegetatively for grasses? Well, first of all, vegetative, which I haven't got up on the slide here, but vegetative features go hand in hand with identifying grasses when they're in flower. It's important to get them to species level. You can identify grasses to a certain extent without vegetative features, just with their floristic features, but you're not going to be able to identify all grasses. But interestingly, if you can identify all but maybe a few grasses vegetatively without the floristic features. So it's really, really important. And also it means that you can identify grasses all year round. So if you're an avid botanist getting out in the wilds and wet and wind of winter, you can still be botanizing, which is brilliant. The other thing is, of course, in the summer, very often grasslands are mowed or they're grazed. So it means that you can still identify them even when they're grazed and they have their heads cut off. So that's really good. And we don't have to wait for grasses to flower. So the interesting thing about grasses also is that most flowering plants actually grow from the shoot tips only. But with grasses, it's different. their growing tips are actually deep within the base of the plant. So that's why they're really, really good at being grazed or mowed. They can regrowth is possible all the time. So that's really, really good. Even if the tops of the grasses are removed, they've still got their growing tips because they're low down. And that's why they're so important, as well as supporting a large cohort of grazing animals in the, if you think of the grassland prairies, the savannas, etc., etc. They're really, really important ecologically as well. So what about a grass when it's not in flower? Yes, we depend on their non-flowering vegetative features. And I can hear maybe some of you saying, well, grasses look green and all the same, and you're asking me to tell the difference without the grass heads. It's bad enough with the grass heads. Now you're telling me there's no grass heads, no flowering parts, and you're expecting me to identify them now. But so there is a perception that it's quite difficult, but it's more accessible than you think. So don't be put off. There's just 3 main aspects to vegetative grass ID that are important. And they're simply recognizing and examining a selection of vegetative features, first of all right? And we're going to go through those. There are about 8 categories, and I'll go through those today. So if you're clear and you can recognize those, you're a long way to identifying grasses vegetatively. The second aspect is it's all about measuring widths and lengths of those features. So that's another thing. So you need a little ruler of some sort. And then the third thing that we won't deal with today, but we'll deal with the next webinar, is being familiar with the ID keys and how they work. So we're going to deal with, I suppose, the aspect 1 mainly today. We're not going to measure much today, really. That'll come when we're identifying species, individual species next week. Now, just to remember, it does take practice, but once you are familiar with the basics, it's much easier to progress. So just to remember, sometimes, especially for those of you who are complete beginners, features of grasses needed for identification are usually very, very small. And some of them are actually tiny. So you do need a hand lens. So if you don't need a hand lens, or if you don't have a hand lens, it's probably an essential part of identifying grasses. You do need a hand lens. So I'll show you a hand lens in a minute. I know Fionnuala went through this last week as well, but I'll show you in the next slide about a hand lens. And also the other thing is that me as a botanist, sometimes I take it for granted that people know how to use a hand lens. Hand lenses, there's a special way to use a hand lens correctly, and it's bringing the hand lens right up to your eye. So you have it right nearly stuck to your eye, like a monocle, if you like, and you bring the specimen up to your eye into focus. Some people that are beginners tend to try to use it like a magnifying glass and put it down onto the plant, but you're not going to get the full benefit of doing that way. So I found actually a nice little YouTube video there this morning. It's only 30 seconds long. So if you're not sure how to use a hand lens, it's well worth looking at that video. It'll show you exactly how to use a hand lens correctly. So just to say that most of the features, the close-up features in the photos and diagrams that I'm showing today are greatly magnified. So, it's just getting a sense of size. We're dealing with small things here. So think small, get really, really close in and personal with the grass specimen that you have. Okay, so what do you need? You probably know this from last week if you were here. So you need a hand lens. Times 10 is the best, times 10. So, but what I have is there on I think you can see my pointer. I'm just pointing to the second hand lens there. If you are buying a hand lens for the first time, it's often a good idea to get a combination of lenses. This one is a times 10 and a times 20. so that when you become more advanced, a ×20 can be really handy for really, really small things. But if you're just interested in the basics, a ×10 is exactly what you want. Don't go buying a ×20 on its own. It's too much, and it's actually, you can't see the features as well. A ×10 is the best. But if you want to get into botany, or you're into botany already and you need to look at things in more detail, having an option of 2 lenses is a really good thing. A transparent 6-inch ruler is essential for vegetative features. It's really handy. I actually have one that's in half. It broke, and it was the best thing that happened, because it's just 3 inches and it just fits in my pocket and is perfect for identifying grasses. Transparent because you can see the feature underneath and you know exactly what size you have. But most vegetative keys, if you have one out in the field, have on the back page or on each page usually a scale. But it's good to have a ruler, in my opinion anyway. So, and the third thing is that you need is a grass key, or an ID guide at least. There's a selection of 6 of them down there. Now there are more, but I'm not going to get into those today, because first and foremost, let's get the basics covered first and get them right and get them clear. And then we can progress on to looking at keys next week. So I'll start with looking at the overall structure of a grass, just the vegetative features. And then what we'll do is we'll look at more detailed look at all the different parts of the plant, and that's essential for identification. So first of all, the overall structure. Here you have a diagram of a general grass. And just to say, these diagrams come from the Grass ID book published by the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And most of the all of the photographs come from that guide as well. So just some of the photographs are actually named. The ones that have got names to them were kindly donated for the guide by that particular person. If the photograph is named, there's a couple of photographs from Wiki Commons as well, but most of them are from the guide. So let's have a look at this grass here. Let's start at the top. You have the newest leaf coming at the shoot. Now the important thing about this newest leaf in the bud or the new shoot here is whether this leaf is rolled or folded in the bud. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail later on, but that's an important vegetative feature. You have your leaves obviously coming out of the plant here. Leaves arise from the top of the sheath, and the sheath is a wrapping around the stem, which is along here. Hopefully you're seeing that pointer. If you're not, Sarah, you might let me know that you can't see it, but I'm assuming you can. So leaves are important in terms of their width, their size, whether they're hairy, whether they're not. We'll get into that in a minute. Sheaths are important: color, hairy, hairless, closed, open. So we'll have a look at that in a little while too. Sometimes grasses have stolons. These are horizontal stems that spread above the ground, and they can root at the nodes and send up these little new plants here. All right. You also have horizontal stems that run underground on the right here. These are rhizomes. And again, they can send up new little shoots. These are called tillers. You'll hear, maybe if you're from a farming background, it's really advantageous to have grasses that perform tillering, because if they're grazed, it encourages tillering, which encourages a thicker sward. So rhizomes are important in terms of grazing plants. So those are important whether they're present or absent, or short or long. And there's a photograph down here just to show what stolons might look like. These are on the side of a pathway, and they're just literally creeping out across the pathway here. So we'll get into these in a little bit more detail. Now, if you don't have creeping stolons and rhizomes, the grass is likely to look very compact and tufted like this. Whereas if you have stolons and rhizomes, it probably looks more carpeted and spread out and less tusky. So sometimes it's hard to say where the plant actually starts and ends if it's got stolons and rhizomes. But we're going to have a look at leaves, sheaths, buds, all these parts here in more detail. So what are we going to have a look at? We'll have a look at 8 aspects to start with. So we're going to have a look at 1, the leaves, 2, the youngest leaf in the bud, 3, the sheaths, 4, ligules. And if you're not sure what ligules and auricles are at the moment, you'll soon know. We're going to have a look at auricles, the stems, whether a grass is annual or perennial, and whether they've got rhizomes or stolons, and how to know whether there are ways to tell, all right? So we'll start with the leaves. So just before we get into the leaf itself, just to orientate yourself, here is the stem, which is often called the culm in a grass. You have the leaf here arising from the sheath, and you can just make out a sheath that wraps around the stem here. And at the junction of the sheath and the leaf, you have what's known as a ligule. It's a little, we'll look at it in more detail now in a minute, but it's usually a little membranous, little translucent little piece of, it's almost like a really thin greaseproof paper, just here at the junction. That's really important for identification purposes. You also have nodes in grasses. Now, nodes usually occur on the flowering stems, and when they're not flowering, you don't always have nodes, but they can also be called knees, and they can be hairless, or this one here is an example of a hairy knee here, or a hairy node, and that can be important as well for identification purposes. But you're not always going to see the nodes. Sometimes grasses don't have nodes present when they're in the vegetative state. Okay, so let's have a look at leaves. I suppose the first and foremost thing is width and length is really important. And this is where your ruler is going to come in handy, because you can have flat leaves, and they can be maybe like 3 or 4 millimeters wide, but they could be up to 8-10 millimeters wide as well. So the width is important when you're identifying grasses. But you can have flat ones of various widths, or you can have bristle-like leaves, which are really, really, they can be tightly curled, and they almost look sort of pin-like, if you like. So that's important. Bristle-like versus flat leaves will split up quite a lot of grasses for you into different groups. So yeah, and these represent here just a cross-section of what the leaf might look like if you cut it transversely. So that's important. So width and length. Second of all, let's have a look at leaves in more detail here. Also, that's important. Are they hairy? If so, where are they hairy? Or maybe they're hairless. Are they prominently ribbed, or are they not? Are they stiff? What color are they? So this gives you an example here of leaves that are prominently ribbed and leaves that are not prominently ribbed. So this can be a confusion for beginners, because they look at a grass on a leaf and they see the veins, the leaf veins. You can see them here. And they think, well, I can see the veins. These must be the ribs, so it must be prominently ribbed. But in fact, what we mean by prominently ribbed is that they're really deeply channeled. And you'll often find these in coastal grasses, say like marram grass that grows on sand dunes, etc. They're really deeply ribbed. They're really, really stiff as well. So when they're prominently ribbed, you'll know it. If you're not sure, they're probably not, put it that way. So just to show you this leaf here on the right, if you zoom up here with your hand lens, you'll see that it actually is hairy as well. There's plenty of leaves that are hairless, but it's hairy in this case. This leaf to the naked eye looks hairless, but this is shows the importance of using a hand lens. If you use a hand lens and look very closely at the ribs, they're hairy on the ribs, all right? But underneath the leaf on the underside, they're hairless, but just the ribs are hairy. So it's important just to get a sense of where those hairs are. Are they all over? Are they on the upper side? Are they on the lower side? Are they just on the ribs if it's kind of a coastal grass? So it's just to get an idea of where those hairs are. The other thing is that very often coastal grasses are grayish in color, or green grayish, or a blue green. This color is called glaucus. So that can also be a telling feature as well if they're gray green, or glaucus is the word that they'll use in the keys. And again, they can be pretty stiff. So just to give you an idea of what you might look for in the leaves. Now, number 2 then is looking at the youngest leaf in bud. Where do you look? These little diagrams in here will just give you a location of where we are for each feature. So we're looking at the growth tips, the grass tips, all right? So if you have a look at the newest leaf, if you get a piece of paper and you roll it up like a scroll, that's what you've got here on the left. The new leaf that is emerging is rolled up like a little scroll. So if you cut it transversely, you'd see a little roll here like this. So again, some grasses are really obvious. You can see them without using a hand lens, and some of the smaller grasses, you'll need a hand lens to have a look, and just turn the grass around in your hand to check it out. So you can see how this is a new leaf, and it's in a roll, it's scrolled around itself, and it's emerging from the top of the shoot there. On the right hand side, on the other hand, this is a leaf that's actually folded in the shoot. So get your piece of paper and just fold it over like a book. And that's the way this leaf is here, coming out of the shoot. And this can split up grasses quite easily into 2 separate groups. Grasses that are rolled in the shoot with the new leaf, and grasses that have their new leaf that's folded in the shoot. It's a really good way of deciphering 2 major groups of grasses. Just to note that there are some grasses that do both. And in the keys, that's why you might find 1 or 2 species of grass in 2 separate, different sections in a key, because they behave differently sometimes. But that's covered usually in keys, that if you get one that's rolled, you'll get to the right place in one part of the key. But if it's folded, it'll still bring you to a different place, but to the same species. So just to be aware of that. Okay, sheaths then. We're down, this is the covering that wraps around the stem here on the grass. So what's important with sheaths is the color, and basically whether it's hairy or not hairy, and also whether it's wrapped or it's like a tube, which I'll talk about in a minute. But let's have a look at whether the sheath is hairless. This is a hairless sheath, and this one is obviously very hairy on the right hand side. And also the color, you'll notice the sheath on the left-hand side is green all over, but you'll notice that this sheath here on the right-hand side is got noticeably pink stripes in it, and it's a yellowish color. So again, color, shapes, hairs, etc. is important. So very, very different. And then sheaths, the other thing is whether a sheath is open or closed. This can be important for some grasses. You'll notice that this is the same photograph as I had in the last slide. This sheath is open. It's just wrapped around the stem, but it's, if you can see here in the transverse section, there's a little gap there. So it's just like as if somebody has a jacket on without buttoning it up or zipping it up. So it's an open sheath. But some species of grasses have tubular sheaths that there's no split down the middle at all. So it's like putting on a jumper rather than having a zipped up jacket, if you like. And it can have it's like a V-shaped jumper really. So it's tubular all the way around. And this will identify, there's a group of grasses that can be split up using this feature here. So to see whether it's tubular or not, you will need a hand lens. And often what you can do is you can just hold the grass stem and gently pull back on the leaf, and hopefully if it's open, it'll peel back nicely and split. But if you peel back gently with a closed sheath, it won't pull back easily because it's tubular. But you have to be careful you don't tear it as well. All right. So those are the sheaths. Ligules then, these are the little things I mentioned earlier. They're at the junction of the leaves. Now, there are two types of ligules in grasses, and it's really handy to decipher between these two early on in your identification, because what you can have are ligules that are membranous. These are like, as I say, really thin greaseproof paper, almost translucent little pieces of projections coming out from the leaf junction there. But also they can be actually a comb of hairs or a ridge of hairs, or they can be referred to as a ring of hairs. And you can see here, this ligule here is a very, very fine comb of hairs. Some species, these comb of hairs are quite noticeable with the naked eye, and you say, oh yeah, straight away they're a comb of hairs. Some are so small that with the naked eye you mightn't think it has a ligule at all. So again, it's important to use a hand lens and get up really close, peel back the leaf and get up close with the hand lens to have a look. But those comb of hairs actually split up just a few grasses from everything else, and it's a quick way of eliminating a certain amount of species. So that's really handy. So let's have a look at more detail at some membranous ligules. Shape and length is really important. So again, this is where your ruler comes in. It's really handy to put the base of the ruler at the base of the ligule and see how many millimeters it is. That's really important. This ligule is broader than long. So you can see that it's quite broad, but it's very, very short and flattened on top. This one here is longer than broad, and it's quite pointed. So there are ligules that are longer than broad, but flat on top. Some of them might have a toothed top. Some of them might have special little distinctive points, like this diagram here. Here's the ligule here. Here's your sheath. So again, shape can be important. The fringe, the very top, can be important, whether it's pointed, whether it's blunt, whether it's taller than broad or broader than long. And here's one very, very long one from marron grass, actually, which is exceptionally long ligule. So again, it's just getting used to looking at the different shapes of ligules. So, and again, get in with a hand lens. Some grasses look as if they don't have ligules at all, but all grasses do have ligules. It just might be that the ligule is just so minute that it's really hard to see even with a hand lens. There are a couple of grasses that are like that. So if you come across a grass and you're really confused because you can't see a ligule and the key is telling you it has a ligule that's really, really small, take it that it is there, but it's just so small. So number 5 then, we're looking at auricles, and you will find these auricles if they're present. They're not always present. Ligules are always present, but auricles are present in some species, but they're not present in others. So here we have a grass, we have our leaf, we have our ligule, and we have our sheath. So right at the top of the sheath, opposite the ligule or opposite the leaf, you might have these little projections growing out. And these are called auricles. And auricles, another word for ears, I suppose. So the common word for these is ears. So these, if a grass has ears or auricles, you'll find them right here. Now, this diagram here shows you auricles that are really obvious. And like, say, for example, barley has really obvious ears or auricles. And you can see in the diagram here that the auricles are really, they're so kind of obvious and large that they're crossing over each other. So they're very, very obvious with a naked eye. But there are auricles that when you're a beginner, you sort of, certainly from my point of view, when I was looking for auricles, I was looking for these big claw-like guys here. And when I was coming across grasses that sort of had smaller auricles or different shaped auricles, I wasn't sure whether it had auricles at all, and it was really confusing. And I found this quite difficult part of learning. So hopefully I can put your mind at rest with the next slide. Here are some auricles. First of all, are they present or not? This is what a grass will look like if they're absent on the left-hand side. You'll actually just see the start of the ligule just here. So here are grasses that have auricles. Now this one was one that used to confuse me a lot. This is auricles that are present, but look, they're kind of lobed. This is just a close-up. Anything in a yellow box is a close-up of the picture beside it. So look at them, they're lobed. They're not claw-like, but there's a little curl in it. So that curl is actually an auricle. All right, so if you come across a grass that looks kind of curly at the junction, it's likely that it has an auricle. This one here is your obvious one from the page before. Have a look at this. This is another one now that you might, if you looked with the naked eye, you'd say, no, it doesn't have auricles. But look very, very closely. This little ditty thing here is the auricle. It's teeny tiny. It's like a little thread. So that is an auricle. So again, it's getting up really, really close. And you can see there's a little bend in it here as well. So just getting used to different shaped auricles. You've got a lot of variety of auricles. Some of them are really obvious. Some of them are not so obvious. Some of them are tiny. And the other thing is, which is important, is that if you look at one stalk and you think there isn't auricles, but they're kind of, there's waviness going on, check the same species, but just check other stalks and other stems, because sometimes the auricles can be knocked off or damaged. And maybe they're not obvious on all the stems. So have a good look at a few stems just to be sure, okay? So that's auricles. Now, stems. What's important, I suppose, with stems is if you cut them in transverse section, are they rounded in section or are they quite flattened? That's the main thing we're looking for here. So here's a rounded stem, and if you cut it and looked at it in section, you'd see that it's very, very round. Whereas here's a very flattened stem. Sorry, it's not a great photograph, but a very flattened stem, and if you cut it, it actually looks quite flattenedy oval shape. That can be important for identification purposes as well. And if you have a look down here, some of them, this is a diagram here, but some of them are really, really noticeably flattened. And if you get your fingers and roll the stem in your hand, if you're not sure, you can get a feel of whether something is oval or rounded as well. So that's the most important thing here. And you'll also notice while we're on this photograph, this is typically hollow. Do you see the hollow center? Grasses tend to be hollow inside. So that's also a feature that's important, deciphering whether you've got a grass as opposed to a sedge, as opposed to a rush, say, for example. Most grasses are hollow stemmed. Now I know I'm throwing an awful lot of, especially if you're a beginner here today, I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but just, you know, I'm not expecting you to remember all this, but it's, as long as you understand it as we go along, and it'll be up on the website. Sarah will kindly put it up on the BSBI website if you want to look at this webinar again, just to remind yourselves of what parts are important. So, and again, if you're familiar with grasses and you're quite experienced, this will all be pretty familiar for you anyway. So, okay, so annual or perennial. This is very often when you got a vegetative key, you're asked, is the grass annual or perennial? And you're sitting there thinking, how am I supposed to know? Because I'm not going to be sitting here for 3 years to see if it's still growing in 3 years' time. And I don't know how long this grass has been here. How am I supposed to know whether it's annual or perennial? So there is just a simple trick on deciphering that. And it doesn't always work, but it is a good indicator. If it's an annual grass, that's a grass that just grows and seeds and everything in 1 year and then dies off in one season. It's going to be mostly have fresh growth. So on the left-hand side, there's no evidence really of a load of dead leaves or dead parts from previous years. It's going to be pretty green and fresh growth that you can see. Whereas if it's an annual or perennial, you're very likely to see old parts of the old sheaths or leaves from the previous year at the base. So you're more likely to see that. The other thing, near the end of the season, if it's an annual grass, you're likely to see that it's actually looks straw-like and dead. It just dies off at late autumn. And in the wintertime, you won't find it. So there won't be any trouble that way. An annual grass just won't be seen in the winter, except for one species, which is annual meadow grass, which will flower at any time of the year and grow at any time of the year, even in the winter. I will show you, if we have time today, I'll show you that today. And if we don't, I'll show you the next webinar. But generally speaking, annual, very green, it can be quite big, but it's not really established looking as such, and not much evidence of dead, withered, old remains of the plant. So that's probably the best way of knowing whether it's annual or perennial. Now, the other thing is, if you're not sure and you don't know where to go in a key, if it says grassland annual or perennial, and you're not sure, the best thing to do is follow through the key for annual option and see where you get. And if the descriptions match where you're going, you're on the right track. But if you come to a dead end and it's not really matching your grass, well then try the perennial route and you'll probably get the correct answer then. Sometimes if you're not sure, it's good to go try both directions in a key, and then you'll come either to the right answer or the wrong answer, and you'll know pretty soon. So, but again, that's another story for next week. Okay, just getting back to rhizomes and stolons, if they're present or absent, or some species have one or other or both. This is the part in a key that really flummoxes people. And to be honest, it still catches me out too. I find this rhizomes and stolons are unless they're obviously growing there, sometimes they're not obvious, and it can be quite difficult in the key. And again, the same option as the annual perennial, go either direction and check both directions out in a key. And if you don't know what I mean by that, don't worry about that when we're looking at keys next week. If you're still with us, hopefully you will be, we'll have a look at that in more detail and explain what I mean by that. But basically, if you're looking for stolons, just look on the surface, like say if you're in a field, or just part the grass and have a look underneath and see if you can get the base of the plant, and you'll see these horizontal stolons running out through the grass. But again, some plants have stolons and they're actually quite difficult to find. Rhizomes, on the other hand, won't be seen on the surface. You won't see them. The only way of knowing is for sure is to actually dig them up with a little trowel and see if you can find them. Again, they vary in color. They can be brown, they can be white. But one way of just getting a feel whether there's rhizomes or stolons there is to actually look at the growth itself, in the sense of, if you have a look on the left hand side, here's a field of bent grass, and you can see that it's the same species throughout this photograph. You cannot really decipher where one plant starts and one ends, really. It looks like it's just a big carpet of the same grass. That is a real sign that there's creeping rhizomes or stolons going on there. Because if you have a look here at the top right picture, this is a rhizome, and look, all these little branches here are new shoots or tillers, if you like. So they spread evenly throughout a field. And this is one way of the plant reproducing vegetatively. So it doesn't have to flower, it's actually reproducing and making new plants by shoots from its rhizome. So that would be a sign that there might be rhizomes or stolons present. If there isn't rhizomes or stolons present, you usually see a grass looks quite tufted. You can see here on the right hand side here, it's just one tuft. You can easily see where this plant starts and finishes. It's just in a nice neat tuft here. So that would be a sign, one, that there's no stolons or rhizomes present, or two, that they're so short that they're not really worth mentioning in a key. So I suppose in a key you will be asked about long creeping rhizomes and stolons rather than really short ones. So tufted versus nicely carpeted look. That'll give you an idea whether they're present or not. Okay, so habitat can also be really important. And I know Fionnuala touched really nicely on this last week. And I know there was a few questions on it as well. So I'm not going to get into this really, but just a habitat, what type of habitat you're in can really be a really good indicator of what species you might have. Whether it's aquatic, coastal, shaded, woodland, upland, peaty soil, dry calcareous, well-drained soil, or agriculturally improved or semi-improved, higher nutrient levels, etc., all can be really important. I'm not going to get into that today, but just to bear in mind that where you are, you've got aquatic species, you've got coastal species, you've got species that will only grow in mountain heaths, say for example. You'll have grasses that will only grow in dry calcareous conditions, and you'll have species that are grasses that are shade tolerant that will grow in woodlands, which are actually there's only a few of those because grasses tend to need a lot of sunlight. So the shaded ones are quite easy to identify because there's just a few of them that like shade. And then of course agriculturally improved, you've got grasses that are generally like higher nutrients and very often are seeded anyway by the farmer because they want high productive grass for pasture. So again, and in some keys they'll ask you, is it in an aquatic situation, or where would you find it? And again, the habitat not only indicates the species, but the species that you find might indicate what the habitat is like as well. And I know Fionnuala touched on that last week as well. So those are the sort of 8 aspects plus habitat and features that you need to be familiar with. So the other thing is whether you have a grass, a sedge, or a rush. This can be quite a challenge sometimes as well. So do I have a grass, or do I actually have a sedge or a rush instead? So I'm just going to explain to you very briefly what a sedge and a rush and a grass, how to decipher between the three. We'll be having a webinar at a later stage on sedges if anybody's interested, and I'll go into more details about sedges then. But we'll just have a look at sedges and rushes very briefly in terms of grasses here. So sedges, grasses and rushes are known as graminoids. That means that they're grass-like in appearance. So there are three families, as I said, the grasses, the sedges, the rushes that are graminoids. But what is the difference between the three? If you have flowering and fruiting features, it's really easy to tell apart with a hand lens, and you can be diagnostic and absolutely positively sure that you've got a grass, a sedge or a rush by looking at their flowering parts, or later in the season looking at their fruiting parts like their seeds and stuff. But if you don't, and if they're not flowering and you've only got vegetative features, you need to have a close look at a few things in combination. And I'll just explain that. I have a table in the next slide. Well, actually the slide after that. This one is just a simple and general rule first. Sedges have edges. Sedges tend to have triangular stems. They do look grass-like, but they tend to be triangular. Rushes are round. They tend to have round leaves or round stems. And grasses have knees or nodes, and they tend to be hollow, right? Now, that's all very well, but it's not enough, because some sedges don't have edges, they're rounded. Some rushes aren't round, and grasses don't always have knees or nodes, because vegetatively sometimes they're not present. So it's a good start, but it's not enough. Have a look at this table here. So the blue shade means these are the features that make it absolutely sure whether you've got a grass, a sedge or a rush. So just very briefly looking at these, you'll notice, now Fionnuala talked last week about a grass flower here on the right, and they've got two glooms, 1, 2. So she explained that really well last week. So those are the two glooms. So if you have two glooms, you know you have a grass. On the other hand, if you look at a rush flower, they're not called glooms, they're called segments. You have 6 segments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're brown usually, and there's 6 of them around the little flower in the middle. Whereas a sedge, you actually only have 1 gloom, all right? And you have your flower here, or your utricle in the middle. So that's diagnostic, and you can tell straight away by the flower which one you have. And you can also tell by the fruit. What you call it, a sedge has a little sort of flask-shaped fruit. The rush has a little capsule, and if you split it open, you'll see tiny little seeds inside. And a grass has just 1 single grain or 1 seed as a whole. So those are the features that are diagnostic. But if you don't have those, you depend on vegetative features, which are in the green here. You have to examine them as a whole. So sedges, triangular stem, generally speaking, and almost always solid, all right? Rushes, round, often hollow, or often filled with sponge, but if they're not and they're hollow, they're sectioned internally like a little ladder, if you like. If you split a stem down longitudinally, you see little sections inside. Grasses tend to be hollow and rounded. The other thing that I suppose is the best way of telling is to have a look at the ligule. So in a grass, we've had a look at the ligule, and you'll see that it sticks up, it's attached to the base where the sheath is. It's attached by its base, but it sticks up. If you pull back the leaf, it sticks up independently of itself. Whereas with a sedge, if you peel back a leaf of a sedge, the ligule is actually fused to the base of the leaf for its entire length, except for a tiny little margin on top. And rushes generally don't have ligules, and if they do, they're so tiny that you can take it that they're not really significant. So I suppose it's the ligule that matters. So let me just run through an example of a graminoid here. This is one that I found in the back garden actually only yesterday, and I've been walking over it for the last couple of weeks, just assuming that it was a grass, and maybe it is a grass, we'll find out. So is it a grass? It looks like a grass. Or could it be a sedge? What features do I check? So if you got a scenario like this and it looks, you're not quite sure, let's have a look and see what we have to do about that. So number one, let's examine the stems. So I picked a bit of this and I just split it with my nail really, transverse section, and look, you can see that it's got a triangular stem. And is it solid or hollow? It's solid, okay? So that points towards a sedge. Let's examine the ligule. Are they fused along their length of leaf? If it is, it's a sedge. Or is it only attached to the leaf by the base? So here is the stalk, and I've peeled back this like a banana, really, like a banana peel. Here is the ligule here, and it's absolutely fused to the leaf in its entire length, except for a little margin at the top. So that tells me it's actually a sedge. So just to be careful, because some sedges do look pretty grassy, and that's an example of one, all right? In terms of rushes, they're easy enough to recognize, really. They look rush-like. Here's a typical rush that is, the stems are rounded, they're generally stiff, they're shiny, they're spongy inside, but that's for another day, okay? But if it looks grassy, we have some rushes that do look grassy. So if it's a grassy rush, here we have the wood rush. Here, this is the one that you find typically in woodlands, very broad leaves. And here's another wood rush that you'll find, actually, it's the meadow wood rush that you're going to find more in grassy areas. Very grassy leaves. The key here, you won't find a ligule for a start if you peel back the leaf. And the other thing is that you will have very long whiskery hairs, just striggledy all over the place, either along the margins of the leaves, or particularly with this meadow one here, around the junction of the leaf and sheath. And although you do have whiskery hairs in grasses, in rushes, they're particularly long and striggly, as you can see. They almost look like sort of wool fibers or something. So if you have those, you know that you have a rush and not a grass. So let me see how we're doing for time. It's an hour now, so there's so much I'm sure that you can take in. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to finish here with saying, where do you go from here, I suppose, from today? So if you want to practice but have no key or book of your own, I have found a free online vegetative grass key, which is a really good start if you want to practice. It's by the Bristol Regional Environmental Record Centre, and it's free to download at the link there, and it's got a really good selection of grasses. It doesn't have all of them. It's a British-based one, so I suppose like Irish vegetation is slightly different, although very similar, but just you may find that there's species, you know, in it that aren't necessarily typical of the Irish situation, but that doesn't matter. It's a really good start. You can download it. It's actually designed, if you look at it as a PDF, but it's designed to be printed and then made into a little booklet. So when you look at it online, the pages are all in different order. They're in a book order, I suppose. But I've downloaded it myself and tried it out. And I found it really, really good. It's a great little thing. And certainly if you don't have a key of your own, it's a good place to start. So just a recommendation, I suppose. What I would really encourage you to do is to go out anywhere. It doesn't matter whether it's your garden, local park, waste area, fields, mountain, roadside verge, it doesn't matter. Have a look at the grasses that are growing there. Now, I know we haven't looked at actually identifying particular species today, but we've gone a long way in equipping ourselves to be able to do that. And that's what we'll be doing next week. So what I really encourage you to do is go out, have a look at, just go out and, what am I trying to say? Try to decipher between different species of grasses. You don't have to know what they are, you don't have to know their names, but just to observe the differences. Have a look at the ligule, have a look whether the youngest leaf is rolled or scrolled in the bud. Does it have auricles? Does it not have auricles? Is it hairy? What are the sheets like? What color sheets are there? Are they tufted? Are they creeping? Are they annual? Are they perennial? Have they got flattened stems? What sort of habitat have they got? And if you want to download that key, by all means, give it a go. Or if you have your own key, give it a go as well, absolutely. But it's just getting out, having a look at these features, recognizing them, and getting practice at seeing the size and dimensions, and maybe just comparing one grass with another, even though you haven't a clue what they are, but knowing that they're different and why they're different. And if you do that, that will really set you up really nicely for next week's webinar. The other thing I'd say to you is that do buy a hand lens if you don't have one. Definitely, it's really, really important. Do practice, because it takes patience and it does take an effort to learn a new skill, no matter what it is. Don't lose heart, because if it doesn't come naturally to you and you find it challenging, I certainly found grasses very challenging when I started, and I was kind of completely lost. So it's really important. I actually went out, and this is years ago, but when I first started learning grasses, I went out with BSBI people, and again, brilliant to be part of either a naturalists group, a local naturalist group, or a local botanist, or join the BSBI and go out on BSBI with botanists. They're always really, I found even the most expert person, they don't get impatient with you. They're only delighted to teach you and show you the skills that they have learned. So it's really good if you can get out and seek help and support in your learning, if you like. And when you become more competent and you're confident about your identification, then do record, keep your records, keep a record of where you found it, what sort of habitat it was in, the date that you recorded it in, and you know, what do you call it, coordinates, geographical coordinates where you found it, because those records are invaluable. It doesn't matter how common the species is, but just to keep those records and share them either with the BSBI or with a wildlife record centre closest to you. If you're in Ireland, the National Biodiversity Data Centre would be the place to submit your records. If you're in another country, I'm sure you have record centres as well. It's really, really important to provide records if you can. It's great, because we can then keep an eye and track changes in our vegetation as we move through the years, especially in times when we're going through a crisis in biodiversity loss and climate change. these records are now invaluable at telling us how these changes are occurring. And it's the likes of us and volunteers or enthusiasts that create a lot of these records. So it's really, really good. So just a couple of links there to the BSBI and the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And just to say, I don't think I have another slide yet, just to say, look, thank you very much for listening, because I know it's a lot of information to take in an hour. And thank you very much for the support of Sarah here hosting this. And also Louise, I think, has been great. She's been taking questions, which I'm looking forward to hearing now in a sec. So thank you very much for being with me today. And just finally, just next week, I have a plan for next week's webinar, but I'd be really interested if, you know, if you have things that you would really like covered, or there's aspects of vegetative ID for grasses that you really need help in, I'd love to hear them. If you want to propose them as a question now, I can include them in next week's webinar, or Sarah has a feedback form that she'll be giving you. And if you want to fill in there any parts that I haven't covered today that you would like covered next week, I'd be delighted to hear, because it's for you that this webinar is for, and I'd like to help you in the best way possible. If you have needs and things that I might overlook, do let me know. So look, I'll stop sharing this. Thanks a million, and we'll take your questions whenever you're ready. Cheers.
Thank you so much for that, Lynda. That was really, really fantastic. Great to cover all the basics. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, and Louise has done a great job answering some of them as we've gone along, but I think some of them are ones that will be worth asking again.
Great.
So, Louise, do you want to start with the first question?
Okay, are you able to hear me?
Yep. Hi, Louise.
Okay, hi there. What do we want to start with? I would really just, in the first instance, point people towards the excellent Irish Grasslands webpage. I'm not sure if you're able to see that. I'm trying to share my screen and it's not working yet. Give me a sec.
No, I'm afraid it's not working, Louise.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh, anyway. I hate it when the technology lets you down.
Yeah.
No, sorry. Anyway, if you go to the BSBI website, you should find it pretty easy to land on the Irish Grasslands Project webpage. And there's also a link there to a new Grass ID page that we set up just yesterday to try and put loads of resources and pointers on there for you. And there's a few things that have come up that people have requested today, so I'll be adding them later. Salt marsh, people are asking about salt marsh species. We do have a plant crib to Spartina species. Again, the plant crib page on the BSBI website should be a big help to you. So I would say for most of your questions in the first instance, go to the BSBI website, have a ferret around, and you should find answers. If not, just contact us. Over to you, Sarah, for the next one.
Okay. Well, pulling a couple of questions together, there were people asking about how environment affects the reliability of certain features like leaf width and presence of hairs, and also how age of the plant can affect those sorts of features. Did you want to say anything about that?
Well, can I just say I've been messaging John Poland with who wrote the Vegetative Key, and he's come back with some helpful answers which we've put up, saying it is to do with age, that hairs can decline as the plant gets older, but most of it is genetic variation. Does that?
Lynda, what would you have to say on that?
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. We do have to be careful about, I suppose, the environmental conditions around, and certainly in terms of, say, length of leaves or height of plant or height of grass. Sometimes you can get grasses in really lush conditions and they are really, really tall. Like they could be up to my waist, say, for example. Whereas if they're growing in kind of, wasteland, they could be pretty small, like almost bonsai'd. So we do have to be careful of environment, all right, certainly with heights and widths as well, and dimensions. That is a very good point. So I suppose in that case, that's where ligule shape and size would be more important than maybe width of leaves, etc. Most keys actually give you the kind of optimum length or width, and then in brackets either side they'll have the kind of extreme, whether they're extremely small or extremely big. So they give the wide range to give you an idea of what those are like. But certainly you have to be aware of that. So think about the habitat you're in, and if you think it's really poor soil, you're likely maybe to get smaller specimens, say, for example. And hairs again, and color, they can be, hairs can be sort of ripped off with age, etc. So that's why it's really important when you're identifying any plant, not just grasses, to have a look at more than one specimen of the same type in the same area, to be sure that you have a really good sort of consensus of what's there, I suppose. So don't just look at one stalk or one sample, try to look at a few in combination, and that can help, I suppose, offstay that issue.
Excellent, thanks for that. Another question that's come through thinking about features that you're looking at says, some grasses have stems which curve upwards from a reclining base, like a Glaucus declinata. How reliable is that as a feature?
Okay, yeah, that's the Glaucus. There's a few species that, yeah, there's one, the declinata is one, and declinata, I suppose, declining. It curves. It's more kind of I can never get the right word there. Prostrate.
Prostrate?
Yeah, I always get confused between those two. Prostrate, and they curve upwards. That is a pretty good feature. But then again, with Glaucus, you have to be very careful because, again, environmental conditions can affect that. But generally speaking, it's looking not just at one curved stem, it's looking at a combination of a cluster of them. Is it kind of common with all those stems or not? And just in terms of Glaucus, very often you are told in a key to look at the ligule in a Glaucus to decipher between them. And just to say, that same species, the ligules are so fine that they get flithered very easily, and it's really, really hard to tell. Their ligules aren't really very reliable because they just get shredded and torn very, very easily. So with Glaucus, I think the diagnostic thing with Glaucus is actually look at the, and I shouldn't say this because it's a vegetative workshop, but you need to look at the floristic features. The lemma is really, really important. And those of you that were at Fanula's talk last week will know what lemmas are. It's not for today, but the floristic features for Glaucus is the most important, really, to be sure.
I'm going to sneak in with one more question about features at the moment, just because I quite like the way this one's written. Excellent presentation, it says. And then now that I know to look for striped pajamas, V-necked jumpers, and zipped up coats, are there any other clothes that are useful in grass identification?
Well, you'll see next week there's hairdos, milk bottles and wine bottles that'll come into play next week.
Fantastic. Louise, are there any others you'd like to bring up at the moment?
No, just people asking about hand lenses and where to buy them. We have shared a link to Summerfield books, which have a whole range of magnifiers and optical equipment. The hand lenses start from about £4, €5, and they go up to 5 times that for the swanky ones with a light. But I would just say you're really going to want to have one. So do treat yourself. You're worth it. You deserve a hand lens.
Absolutely.
Getting the hard sell in there, Louise.
I'm not on commission, I promise you.
All right. There were also a few questions that came through that were more about habitats, I guess. So, I mean, is there somewhere to get a list of what species you'd be looking at in certain habitats or areas?
I'm not actually, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that, because that is a really good question. And I know, let's see. Yeah, do you know what? I don't know offhand, but I'd be surprised if there isn't, because, you know, there are certain grasses that you'll get all across the board, no matter where you go. But there are particular grasses that you'll only find in peatland areas, and et cetera, et cetera. So let me look into that. And if I find it, I'll email you, Sarah, and you might put up a link onto the website. Yep. I don't know offhand today, but let me have a think about it, and I'll see if I can find something.
Can I just say the only thing I think about is the Dominic Price book is very habitat based. So that might be a good starter for people. He does group things under, you know, acid grassland and grasses that you are likely to find in particular habitats. That's not quite answering the question, but I'm afraid that's the closest I can think of at the moment.
Great, thanks.
And within the Irish Grasslands Project, we're working on some resources that will highlight the key indicator species for Annex 1 grassland habitats. So that might be something that's interesting for people. And those will hopefully be ready and free to download from the website at the end of the summer.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Great.
There was also a question about where are the most biodiverse areas for grasses in Ireland?
Well, I think the most biodiverse area for grasslands would be the Burren, County Clare. Incredible diversity of grasslands in they're dry calcareous grasslands. Say, for example, just, you know, in sort of an improved grassland, including non-grassy plants, you might have up to 6-7 species, which would be pretty diverse for, you know, kind of improved grassland in an area, sort of like if you were to look at a sample, say a metre squared. But if you go to the Burren, and I'm including non-grassy species as well, you might find 25-30 species within a metre squared. So they would be the most biodiverse grasslands. And you'll get a lot of really nice grasses that you're not going to find in other parts of the country, because they've been sort of improved agriculturally. There's still a lot of really nice grasses that are getting quite rare now that you'll find in the Burren. So well worth a trip to the Burren to have a look at either lowland grasslands or upland grasslands in the karst landscape as well. Well worth it. And I'd say that's probably the most biodiverse that you'll find. Clonmacnoise, County Offaly is got lovely meadow lands as well there. That'll be another place to see a lot of diverse grass species. So there's 2 examples for you.
Fantastic. And there was also a question on how many grasses are red listed, and is the proportion higher or lower compared to non-grasses? Do you happen to know?
Well, do you know what? I'm actually not sure about the red list of grasses. Again, I would have to check that out for you. I'm not sure offhand, and I could give you a guess, and I could be wrong. So I'm not going to guess that. But that's a good question as well. We do have a number of rare grasses. Whether they're on the red list, I'm not too sure. I'd have to check that out.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's one I don't know offhand either.
Yeah, I'll write those down so I remember. So red list and habitat. I'm just writing these down so I remember. Yep.
There was also a comment. You mentioned about the importance of recording, which obviously, as BSBI Ireland Officer, I definitely advocate the importance of recording and would love for people to send us their records. And you also mentioned the Biodiversity Data Centre, Biodiversity Ireland, for people in Ireland, and they do collect records from the north as well as the Republic. But if you are in Northern Ireland, then CEDaR also has mechanisms for submitting records, and they're a fantastic resource as well. So you can get in touch with them with your records as well.
Yep.
Right. There have been a few people asking if it would be possible to have a copy of your slides. I won't put you on the spot and make you answer now, but I will discuss that with you afterwards.
Well, do you know what? You can put me on the spot because I'd be delighted to share the slides. If anybody wants them, Sarah, you have a PDF version, so
yep.
I'm very happy for it to be shared online if you want, and anybody can access it.
Excellent. We'll put it on the Irish Grasslands Project website then.
Yeah, perfect.
And people can download it.
People that get familiar with grasses, as far as I'm concerned, the better. So that's fine.
Fantastic. Louise, were there any others from you?
No, I'm just scrolling up and down the question and answer thing, and it is great to see so many people saying how much they've enjoyed this session, how much they've learned, and thanking Lynda, which I think we should all do. It's been really great. So,
oh, well, thanks very much.
So much.
Hopefully it's been of use to you. It's been a pleasure. I'm just sorry I can't see you all. It's, you know, it's getting used to talking to a screen all by myself. So I'm just conscious that there's a lot of people out there, so thank you so much for joining today. It's great to see so much interest in grasses. Brilliant. And vegetative grasses at that. So it's brilliant.
Yeah, I have to say I'm really pleased. I think we'll leave it there for questions at the moment because it's getting a little bit late.
Yeah,
but I'll
sure.
see what I can pull out that we may have missed that could maybe be addressed next week.
Sure.
As Lynda said, there'll be an email comes out tomorrow to everyone who was here today asking you to fill out a feedback form. At the bottom of that feedback form, there is a sort of open text area where if you come up with particular questions you'd like addressed next week, you can pop those in there. If you come up with more questions after you've completed the feedback form, you know, later in the week on, say, you know, Wednesday or Thursday, by all means, feel free to email them to me and I'll compile those and get those to Lynda as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
And with that, oh yeah, I
No,
just want to say
go on, yeah,
thanks again to you, Lynda, and also thanks to NPWS and CEDaR for supporting this project. We still have 3 more webinars to go, so if you're interested in those, please go to the website and sign up. There's still a bit of space available.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
And look, thanks again, Sarah, and thank you so much, Louise, for keeping an eye on the questions and everything, and really appreciate everything that you've done today. So thanks, everybody, and take care.
been a pleasure. Bye, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. All the best.